The verse snowfall of December always reminded Andrew Bennett of promises made in darkness, of whispered words that carried more weight than either of them could have imagined. Standing at his apartment window in Center City, Philadelphia, he watched the flakes drift past the streetlights below, each one catching the amber glow like scattered memories refusing to settle. His fingers unconsciously moved to the small velvet pouch in his jacket pocket, the one that had traveled with him through 10 years of different cities, different jobs, different attempts at forgetting. The pendant inside was simple, unremarkable to anyone else. A thin silver chain supporting a small crescent moon, its surface worn smooth from years of nervous handling during moments when the weight of that long-ago promise felt heavier than everything else in his life combined. He had found it on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the morning after what should have been just another forgettable night in December 2010. But Julia Morgan had made it unforgettable. She had been sitting alone on those same museum steps at 2 in the morning, her breath visible in the frigid air, staring up at a sky too clouded for stars. Andrew had been walking home from his job at the late-night diner on South Street, his sneakers crunching through the thin layer of snow that had begun to accumulate on the sidewalks. Something about her stillness, her complete absorption in whatever thoughts held her there in the cold, made him slow his pace and eventually stop. He could still recall the exact timbre of her voice when she spoke without looking at him, as if she had sensed his presence and accepted it as natural as the falling snow. She had said she was waiting for something to change, though she could not name what. Andrew had found himself settling beside her on the stone steps, the cold seeping through his jeans, telling her about his own restlessness, the way Philadelphia felt simultaneously like home and like a temporary stop on a journey he had not yet begun. They had talked until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, their conversation meandering through childhood memories, half-formed dreams, and the particular loneliness that comes from being 22 and uncertain whether the person you are becoming is someone you will be able to respect. Julia had told him she was leaving Philadelphia after Christmas, accepting a teaching position in a small town in Oregon where she knew no one and had never been. Andrew had confessed his plan to move to Chicago in the new year, chasing an internship at an architecture firm that had finally responded to his portfolio. When the morning light grew strong enough to make their impromptu vigil seem strange rather than magical, Julia had stood to leave. She had turned back after a few steps, her dark hair catching the early sunlight, and made him promise that if they were both still searching for something real in 10 years, if they were both still uncertain about the paths their lives were taking, he would find her before Christmas, and they would see whether the connection they felt in those quiet hours had been genuine or simply a product of solitude and snow. Andrew had promised, meaning it completely in that moment, though neither of them had exchanged contact information or last names. They had parted with only first names, and the certainty that 10 years was simultaneously forever and no time at all. He had discovered the pendant 3 hours later, half buried in the snow where she had been sitting. The chain had broken, probably when she stood to leave, and in the dim light of dawn neither of them had noticed. Andrew had picked it up with the intention of searching for her immediately, but Julia Morgan was a common enough name, and Philadelphia was large enough that his initial efforts yielded nothing but frustration. The pendant had become both talisman and burden, a reminder of the only promise that had ever felt more important than his own ambitions. Through the years in Chicago, then briefly in Boston, then back to Philadelphia when his father became ill, Andrew had carried it with him, sometimes forgetting its presence for months at a time, sometimes unable to sleep for the weight of it in whatever drawer or pocket currently held it. Now, December of 2020 stretched before him like a test he had been preparing for without knowing it. The world had shifted in ways none of them could have anticipated that night, 10 years ago. The pandemic had changed everything about how people connected, how they searched for each other, how they defined what was essential versus what was merely desired. But somehow the promise felt more urgent rather than less, as if the forced isolation of the past year had clarified what mattered and what was simply noise. Andrew had begun his search in October, approaching it with the methodical patience his work as an architect had taught him. He started with the obvious channels, social media searches that yielded dozens of Julia Morgans, none of them quite matching his memory of the young woman who had sat beside him in the snow. He expanded his search to include professional directories, teaching associations, and alumni networks from the universities in Philadelphia. The breakthrough had come through the most analog of methods. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small bookstore near his apartment, had mentioned during one of their regular conversations that her cousin taught in a school district outside Portland and had recently worked with a Julia Morgan who had transferred there from a rural district somewhere in eastern Oregon. The connection was tenuous, built on fragments and possibilities, but it was more concrete than anything else Andrew had discovered. He had spent 3 weeks crafting and discarding drafts of a letter, trying to find words that would bridge 10 years of silence without seeming either desperate or insane. In the end, he had settled on simplicity, enclosing a photograph of the pendant and asking whether she might be the Julia who had made a promise on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art in December of 2010. The response had arrived 8 days later, and Andrew had recognized her handwriting immediately, despite having seen it only once. In the signature she had traced in the snow beside the steps as they prepared to part ways that morning. Julia's letter was careful, measured, but unmistakably warm. She was indeed teaching outside Portland now, had been in Oregon for most of the past decade, except for 2 years in Vermont and a brief return to Pennsylvania when her mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She remembered their conversation, their promise, and she admitted to wondering occasionally whether Andrew Bennett was a name that existed beyond that single snow-covered night. She would be spending Christmas in Philadelphia this year, staying with her sister's family in Mount Airy and helping to care for her sister's new baby. She would be at the museum steps on December 23rd at 2 in the morning, exactly 10 years after their first meeting, whether Andrew came to find her or not. She wanted to see what kind of people they had become and whether the connection they had felt was substantial enough to have survived a decade of separate lives. Now, with December 23rd only 3 days away, Andrew found himself oscillating between anticipation and a terror he had not expected. The promise had been made by a different version of himself, someone younger and more optimistic about the likelihood that connections formed in extraordinary moments could translate into ordinary life. The man he had become was successful enough, settled enough, but had learned through various relationships that the intensity he remembered from that night might have been nothing more than the product of circumstance and youthful romanticism. He had loved other people in the intervening years, had lived with Sarah for 3 years in Chicago, and had been briefly engaged to Claire during his time in Boston. Both relationships had ended not through betrayal or dramatic incompatibility, but through the gradual recognition that what they shared was comfortable rather than essential, pleasant rather than transformative. The ending of each relationship had been mutual and civilized, leaving Andrew with the growing suspicion that he was someone who formed connections easily, but struggled to find anything that felt permanent. The pendant, though, had remained constant. He had never mentioned it to Sarah or Claire, had never tried to explain why he carried it or what promise it represented. It existed in a separate category from his practical adult life, like a piece of music that could instantly transport him to a specific moment, but had no relevance to his current circumstances. Walking to his office on December 20th, Andrew caught himself paying closer attention to the women he passed on the street, wondering whether Julia might have returned to Philadelphia earlier than planned, whether they might encounter each other accidentally before their planned meeting. He realized he was not entirely sure he would recognize her after 10 years, despite having thought about her face more often than he would have admitted to anyone. His memory of her was simultaneously vivid and vague, composed more of impressions than specific features. He remembered the way she listened, completely present and unguarded, in a manner that suggested both intelligence and courage. He remembered her laugh, which had emerged unexpectedly during their conversation and had sounded like someone discovering something delightful she had forgotten she possessed. He remembered the particular quality of her attention, the way she asked questions that revealed she was thinking not just about his words, but about the person behind them. But her face in his memory was softer around the edges than a photograph would have been, blurred by time and wishful thinking into something that might be more beautiful than reality could support. Andrew's sister Rebecca had listened to the story with the skepticism of someone who had watched her younger brother navigate various romantic complications with varying degrees of wisdom. She had pointed out that 10 years was long enough for people to change completely, that the Julia he remembered might have no resemblance to the person who would meet him at the museum steps. But Rebecca had also admitted, during a conversation the previous weekend, while they wrapped Christmas presents for her 2 young sons, that she envied Andrew his sense of certainty about what he was looking for. She had been married to David for 7 years, was generally happy, but confessed that she sometimes wondered whether they had chosen each other more through timing and compatibility than through any profound recognition of inevitability. The observation had unsettled Andrew more than he expected. Rebecca's marriage was the most successful relationship he observed regularly, built on genuine affection, shared values, and the kind of steady partnership that made raising children feel manageable rather than overwhelming. If Rebecca could question whether profound connection was real, or simply something people invented to make ordinary love feel more significant, then Andrew's decade-long attachment to a promise made to a virtual stranger began to seem less like romantic dedication and more like an inability to accept that extraordinary moments did not necessarily translate into extraordinary relationships. By December 21st, Andrew had convinced himself that his meeting with Julia would result in polite conversation, mutual acknowledgement that they had both fulfilled their promise, and amicable recognition that whatever they had shared a decade ago had been specific to that moment and could not be reconstructed. He prepared for disappointment while hoping for something else, though he was no longer certain what that something else might be. The weather reports predicted snow for December 23rd, which felt either auspicious or ironic, depending on Andrew's mood at any given moment. He found himself checking and rechecking the condition of the pendant, polishing the silver until it gleamed, practicing different ways of presenting it to Julia without making the gesture seem overly dramatic or presumptuous. On the evening of December 22nd, Andrew received a text from an unknown number that read simply, "Still planning to be there tomorrow night. Looking forward to seeing who we became." The message was unsigned, but Andrew recognized something in its cadence that convinced him it was from Julia. He spent the night alternating between restless sleep and periods of wakefulness, during which he mentally rehearsed different versions of their reunion. In some scenarios, they recognized each other immediately and picked up their conversation as if 10 years had been 10 minutes. In others, they struggled to find common ground beyond their shared memory, discovering that the people they had become were fundamentally incompatible. The most troubling scenario, the one that Andrew found himself returning to despite his efforts to focus on more hopeful possibilities, involved the recognition that while the connection had been real, it had been complete in itself that December night 10 years ago. The promise they had made might have been less about reunion than about honoring something that could not be continued but should not be forgotten. Orchestrated emotional narrative arc toward climactic reunion scene. I need to continue the narrative. I'm building toward the reunion scene. But I want to develop more of Andrew's emotional journey and perhaps provide some insight into Julia's perspective or current life through his thoughts or indirect means. I should also continue building the tension toward their meeting while maintaining the realistic, intimate tone. The story is progressing well. I've established the backstory, their promise, how Andrew found her, and now I'm in the final days leading up to their reunion. I need to continue developing the emotional depth and building toward the climactic meeting at the museum steps. I should aim to continue for more content as I'm still building toward the target word count, and the story needs more development before their actual reunion. December 23rd arrived grey and bitter, with the kind of cold that made the city feel emptied out and expectant. Andrew moved through his day with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think too carefully about the evening ahead. But everything seemed charged with significance. The coffee tasted more intense. Conversations with colleagues felt either profound or completely meaningless, and every glance at his watch reminded him that time was moving both too quickly and too slowly toward 2 in the morning. He left his office early, claiming the need to finish Christmas preparations, though his gifts had been wrapped and ready for days. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like a problem that required solving. Too many empty hours before he could reasonably begin making his way to the museum. Andrew found himself walking aimlessly through Center City, observing the last-minute holiday shoppers and the decorated storefronts with the detached attention of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere. At a small cafe near Rittenhouse Square, he ordered coffee he did not want and tried to read a book he had been carrying for weeks without making progress beyond the first chapter. The words seemed to rearrange themselves each time he looked at the page, and he eventually abandoned the pretense of reading in favor of watching the people at other tables, wondering whether any of them had ever made promises they were not sure they wanted to keep. An elderly couple near the window caught his attention, their conversation quiet and comfortable after what appeared to be decades of shared meals and shared silence. The woman laughed at something her husband said, reaching across the table to touch his hand with the unconscious ease of someone for whom affection had become as natural as breathing. Andrew wondered whether he and Julia, if their meeting led to something lasting, would eventually develop that kind of effortless intimacy, or whether the intensity of their original connection would prove to be incompatible with the ordinary requirements of daily life. The thought surprised him with its specificity. He had spent weeks thinking about their reunion in terms of discovery and recognition, but he had not allowed himself to imagine what might come afterward if the night went well. The possibility of a future with Julia felt both thrilling and terrifying, particularly since it would require dismantling the carefully constructed independence he had built over the past several years. Andrew's apartment had become perfectly suited to solitude, organized around his preferences and routines without the compromises that sharing space required. His refrigerator contained exactly the food he enjoyed. His bookshelves reflected only his reading interests, and his schedule was entirely his own. The prospect of opening that controlled environment to another person, particularly someone whose presence might transform not just his living situation, but his understanding of himself, felt like preparing for an earthquake whose magnitude he could not predict. As evening approached, Andrew returned to his apartment and attempted to occupy himself with practical preparations. He showered and dressed with more care than the occasion technically required, choosing clothes that were warm enough for standing outside in December, but not so formal as to suggest he was treating their meeting like a first date. The pendant in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as the hour approached, its presence both comforting and anxiety-provoking. At 11:30, Andrew put on his coat and began the walk to the museum district. The streets were largely empty, except for the occasional late-night worker heading home, or small groups of friends making their way between bars and restaurants that stayed open despite the cold. The snow that had been threatening all day began to fall in earnest as he crossed the Schuylkill River, individual flakes growing larger and more persistent as he approached the familiar neighborhood. The Philadelphia Museum of Art rose ahead of him like a monument to the significance of moments that could not be planned or replicated. Andrew had visited the museum dozens of times since that December night 10 years ago, but he had never returned to sit on the steps where he and Julia had spent those hours. The building had remained associated in his mind with possibility rather than actual experience, a symbol of connection he was afraid to examine too closely in case it dissolved under scrutiny. As midnight passed, and then 1 o'clock, Andrew found himself walking in widening circles around the museum, trying to manage his nervousness by staying in motion. The snow was accumulating steadily, transforming the familiar landscape into something that more closely resembled his memory of that night a decade ago. The streetlights created pools of golden visibility between stretches of darkness, and the sound of his footsteps was muffled by the growing layer of white covering the sidewalks. At 1:45, Andrew finally approached the museum steps directly, his heart beating with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of walking up a set of stone stairs. The steps were empty, covered with snow that showed no recent footprints, and for a moment he wondered whether he had misunderstood something fundamental about their arrangement. Then he saw her, sitting in the exact spot where she had been 10 years ago, her dark coat making her nearly invisible against the shadowed stone behind her. Julia looked up as Andrew approached, and even in the dim light he recognized the quality of attention he remembered, the way she seemed to take in not just his physical presence, but something more essential about who he was. She had changed, of course. Her face was more defined than it had been at 22, her hair shorter and more deliberately styled, her clothing more expensive and professional than the college student wardrobe he remembered. But when she smiled, Andrew felt the same sense of recognition that had made him stop walking that night 10 years ago, as if he had encountered someone he had been looking for without knowing he was searching. Julia stood as he reached the step where she was sitting, and they faced each other for a moment without speaking, both apparently unsure how to bridge the gap between memory and present reality. The snow continued to fall around them, accumulating on their coats and in their hair, adding a sense of urgency to their reunion that neither of them had anticipated. Andrew reached into his pocket and withdrew the small velvet pouch, holding it out to Julia with a gesture that felt both natural and surreal. She accepted it with hands that were steady despite the cold, opening the drawstring and tilting the pouch so that the pendant slipped into her palm. In the amber light from the nearest street lamp, the silver crescent moon gleamed as if it had been polished moments before, rather than carried in Andrew's pocket for a decade. Julia's expression shifted as she recognized the pendant, her fingers closing around it with the careful pressure of someone handling something precious and fragile. She looked up at Andrew with an expression he could not entirely read. Surprise and gratitude, and something else that might have been relief or recognition, or the beginning of tears. She told him she had not realized she had lost it until several days after leaving Philadelphia, when she was unpacking her belongings in her new apartment in Oregon. By then, returning to search for it had seemed impossible, and she had convinced herself that it was probably better to let it go along with everything else she was leaving behind. She had bought a replacement pendant, she said, but it had never felt right. had never carried the weight of memory that made jewelry meaningful rather than merely decorative. Andrew explained about finding the pendant in the snow, about carrying it with him through moves and relationships, and the gradual understanding that some promises matter more than others. He told her about his failed attempts to locate her in the weeks after they met, about his decision to keep searching despite the apparent impossibility of the task, about his growing belief that their promise represented something worth honoring, regardless of whether it led to reunion or simply to closure. As they talked, the snow fell more heavily, creating a sense of enclosure around them that made the rest of the city feel distant and irrelevant. They discovered that both of them had thought frequently about that December night, had carried the memory of their conversation as a standard against which other connections were measured. Both had wondered whether the intensity they remembered was accurate or whether time and loneliness had transformed an ordinary encounter into something mythically significant. But sitting together again on the same stone steps, their breath visible in the frigid air, the connection they had felt 10 years ago seemed not only real, but still present. They found themselves slipping back into the kind of conversation they had shared that first night, the sort of exchange that felt simultaneously natural and rare, as if they were continuing a discussion that had been temporarily interrupted, rather than beginning something entirely new. Julia told Andrew about her decade in Oregon, about the small town where she had taught elementary school students who knew her entire life story within weeks of her arrival. She described the satisfaction of watching children discover reading and the loneliness of being perpetually defined as the newcomer despite years of residence. She had loved the mountains and the quiet, she said, but had never stopped feeling like she was temporarily visiting rather than actually living. She had left Oregon 6 months ago, accepting a position in a Philadelphia suburb, partly because she missed the East Coast, and partly because some part of her wanted to be geographically closer to the place where she had made a promise she had never forgotten. She had not intended to time her return to coincide with their 10-year agreement, she said, but as December approached, she had found herself thinking more and more about Andrew Bennett, and wondering whether he had meant what he said about searching for her. Andrew described his years in Chicago, his brief engagement, and his eventual return to Philadelphia when his father's health declined. He talked about his growing success as an architect and his growing uncertainty about whether professional achievement was sufficient foundation for a satisfying life. He admitted that every relationship he had attempted felt like preparation for something else rather than a destination in itself. As they talked, Andrew noticed that Julia still wore her hair tucked behind her left ear when she was thinking carefully about something, still gestured with her hands when she was trying to explain something complex. The mannerisms he remembered were still present, but they were now part of a more completely formed person whose experiences had given weight and texture to qualities that had been merely potential 10 years ago. The snow continued to accumulate around them, and eventually Julia suggested they walk rather than sitting still in the cold. They descended the museum steps together and began to wander through the nearby neighborhoods, their conversation continuing without the sense of urgency that had characterized their reunion. They had found each other, had confirmed that their connection was real rather than imagined, and now they had the luxury of discovering what that connection might mean in the context of their current lives. They walked through the empty streets of Philadelphia until the snow began to lessen and the eastern sky started to show the faint lightning that preceded dawn. They found themselves at an all-night diner near South Street, the same one where Andrew had worked 10 years ago, though the management had changed and none of the staff recognized him. Over coffee and eggs that neither of them particularly wanted, Julia and Andrew began the more practical conversation about what their reunion might mean beyond the fulfillment of their promise. Julia would be in Philadelphia through New Year's Day, staying with her sister's family, but with considerable freedom to spend time however she chose. Andrew had taken vacation days for the week between Christmas and New Year, partly in anticipation of their meeting and partly because he had not taken substantial time off in months. They agreed to spend the following day together, Christmas Eve, without making specific plans beyond the general intention to see whether the connection they had rediscovered could survive daylight and ordinary circumstances. They exchanged phone numbers and addresses with the careful formality of people who recognized they were crossing from symbolic reunion into the possibility of actual relationship. When they finally parted as the sun rose over Philadelphia, Julia clutched the pendant in her gloved hand rather than immediately putting it around her neck. She told Andrew she wanted to choose the right moment to wear it again, when she was certain about what it would mean to carry that reminder of promises kept and connections honored, orchestrated narrative progression toward emotional resolution and conclusion. I need to continue the narrative toward the conclusion. The reunion has happened successfully, they've reconnected, and now I need to develop their Christmas Eve day together and build toward the ending. I should show how their connection develops in daylight and ordinary circumstances, and work toward a satisfying conclusion that feels emotionally complete. I'm getting closer to the target word count, but still have room to develop their Christmas Eve together and the final resolution of their story. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the snow from the previous night creating a transformed Philadelphia that seemed designed for the kind of day that would either confirm or complicate everything Andrew and Julia had rediscovered in their midnight reunion. Andrew woke after 3 hours of restless sleep, his mind cycling between contentment and anxiety as he considered the hours ahead. He had arranged to meet Julia at Reading Terminal Market at noon, a location that felt appropriately casual while offering enough activity to prevent their conversation from becoming forced or overly intense. The market during the Christmas Eve morning rush would provide natural distractions and movement, opportunities to discover whether they could navigate ordinary interactions as successfully as they had managed profound conversation in the snow. Andrew arrived 15 minutes early and positioned himself near the entrance where he could watch for Julia while observing the holiday shoppers who moved through the market with the particular urgency of people completing last-minute preparations. Families clustered around the bakery stalls, couples debated flower arrangements, and solitary shoppers moved through the crowds with the focused determination of people checking items off mental lists. When Julia appeared at exactly 12 o'clock, Andrew felt the same slight acceleration of his pulse that had marked their reunion the night before, but tempered now by daylight and the presence of other people. She looked younger in the afternoon sunlight, her dark coat replaced by a deep blue sweater that made her eyes appear more vivid than Andrew remembered. She approached him with a smile that seemed both confident and slightly nervous, as if she too was uncertain about how to navigate this transition from midnight symbolism to afternoon reality. They began by wandering through the market together, sampling food from different vendors and discussing their respective holiday traditions, with the careful attention of people learning whether their preferences and habits might be compatible. Julia mentioned that she typically spent Christmas morning with her sister's family, but had always felt like an observer rather than a participant in their established rhythms. Andrew described his family's tendency toward elaborate Christmas dinners that required days of preparation, but seemed to satisfy some need for ritual that none of them could quite articulate. As they shared a soft pretzel and watched the crowd around them, their conversation gradually deepened beyond holiday small talk. They discovered that both of them had spent the morning thinking about their midnight reunion, wondering whether the intensity they had felt was sustainable, or whether the daylight would reveal it to have been a product of circumstance and nostalgia. Julia admitted that she had woken up questioning whether she had idealized not just their original meeting, but her memory of Andrew himself. 10 years of occasional daydreaming, she said, might have created expectations that no real person could satisfy. She had spent the morning reminding herself that disappointment was not only possible, but probable, that connections forged in extraordinary circumstances rarely translated to ordinary compatibility. Andrew confessed to similar doubts, though his were less about idealization and more about whether the person he had become was worthy of the promise he had made a decade ago. The 22-year-old who had sat with Julia in the snow had been full of possibilities and optimism. The 32-year-old who had found her again was more successful, but also more cautious, more aware of how many ways relationships could fail, despite the best intentions of everyone involved. But as they talked, moving from the market to a coffee shop and then to a bookstore where they discovered a mutual appreciation for authors neither had mentioned the night before, Andrew began to understand that their connection was not diminished by daylight and ordinary circumstances, but rather clarified by them. The Julia he was coming to know was more complex and complete than his memory had preserved, but she was also unmistakably the person who had made him stop walking 10 years ago. They spent the afternoon at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, this time as paying visitors rather than late-night occupants of the exterior steps. Moving through the galleries together, they discovered a shared way of looking at art that involved long periods of quiet observation, followed by sudden insights that one or the other felt compelled to share. Julia stopped for nearly 10 minutes in front of a particular painting of a winter landscape, eventually explaining that it reminded her of the view from her apartment in Oregon during the months when snow covered the mountains and made her feel simultaneously peaceful and isolated. Andrew found himself studying Julia's face as she looked at the paintings, noting the particular quality of attention she brought to visual beauty, the way she seemed to absorb not just the surface appearance of things, but something deeper about their emotional resonance. It was the same quality he had noticed that first night, but now he could see how it had developed through years of teaching children to notice details and ask questions about the world around them. As evening approached, they found themselves reluctant to separate, despite having spent nearly 8 hours together. The easy compatibility they had discovered during the day felt both surprising and inevitable, as if their 10-year separation had been a necessary interval that allowed them to become people capable of appreciating what they had found in each other. Julia mentioned that her sister's family was expecting her for dinner, but she seemed hesitant to honor the commitment when it would mean ending their time together. Andrew suggested that she join his family's Christmas Eve celebration instead, an invitation that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. His parents had been asking about his personal life with increasing frequency over the past year, and introducing Julia would inevitably lead to questions and expectations he was not certain he was ready to navigate. But the prospect of extending their day together, of seeing whether Julia could integrate naturally into his family dynamic, felt worth the potential complications. Julia accepted the invitation with the kind of pleased surprise that suggested she had been hoping for some way to continue their time together without having to suggest it herself. Andrew's family home in Chestnut Hill was exactly the kind of place Julia had imagined when he described his childhood. A large stone house filled with the accumulated possessions and traditions of people who had lived in the same community for multiple generations. His parents welcomed Julia with the gracious warmth of people accustomed to their children bringing home unexpected guests, though Andrew caught his mother's quick glance of speculation when he introduced Julia by name only, without explanation of their history or current relationship status. The evening progressed with the comfortable chaos typical of holiday gatherings, multiple conversations happening simultaneously while people moved between the kitchen and living room in patterns established by years of similar celebrations. Julia integrated into the family dynamic with remarkable ease, helping Andrew's mother with last-minute food preparation while engaging his father in a discussion about urban planning that revealed unexpected knowledge about architecture and city development. Andrew's nephew, Rebecca's 5-year-old son, attached himself to Julia with the immediate affection children sometimes show for adults who take their questions seriously. Julia spent a significant portion of the evening on the floor, building elaborate structures with building blocks while maintaining parallel conversations with the adults in the room, demonstrating the kind of multitasking skill that clearly came from years of managing elementary school classrooms. Watching Julia with his family, Andrew felt a sense of rightness that went beyond romantic attraction or nostalgic attachment to their shared promise. She seemed to belong not just with him, but in the context of his entire life, as if she filled a space he had not realized was empty. The observation was both thrilling and terrifying in its implications for the future they might build together. As the evening wound down and other family members began to depart, Andrew and Julia found themselves alone in the living room with his parents, engaged in the kind of relaxed conversation that follows successful holiday gatherings. His mother asked Julia about her work in Philadelphia, her housing situation, and her long-term plans with the gentle interrogation of someone trying to assess whether this new person in her son's life represented a serious development or merely a passing interest. Julia answered the questions with honesty and humor, describing her temporary arrangement with her sister's family and her intention to spend several months in Philadelphia before deciding whether to make the move permanent. She mentioned her work as a substitute teacher while she explored opportunities in the local school districts, and her general sense that she was in a period of transition that might lead in several different directions, depending on what she discovered about her priorities and preferences. When Andrew's parents finally excused themselves for the evening, leaving Andrew and Julia alone in the living room with the dying fire and the remnants of holiday dessert, the conversation shifted back to the more personal territory they'd been exploring all day. They had successfully navigated family introduction, holiday traditions, and 8 hours of almost constant companionship without exhausting each other or discovering major incompatibilities. Julia curled into the corner of the sofa, her shoes removed and her feet tucked beneath her, and told Andrew that she had not expected their reunion to feel so natural and comfortable. She had prepared herself for awkwardness, for the discovery that their memory of connection had been more powerful than any actual compatibility they might share. Instead, she felt like she was spending time with someone she had known for years, rather than someone she had seen only twice in her life. Andrew admitted that he had been afraid their meeting would feel like a performance, an attempt to recreate something that could not be replicated, rather than an opportunity to discover something new. Instead, he felt like he was finally meeting the Julia he had been curious about for 10 years, the person she had become, rather than the person he remembered. As midnight approached and Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, they found themselves discussing the practical questions that their successful reunion had made relevant. Julia's plan to remain in Philadelphia through New Year now seemed less like a temporary visit and more like an extended audition for a major life change. Andrew's carefully constructed independence seemed less like an achievement and more like preparation for sharing his life with someone who might actually understand him. They made tentative plans to spend Christmas Day together, acknowledging that both of them wanted to continue exploring whatever was developing between them, while also recognizing that 10 years of separation could not be completely overcome by 2 days of intensive conversation, however promising those days might be. When Andrew walked Julia to her car as Christmas began, they stood beside the vehicle for several minutes without moving toward goodbye, both seemingly reluctant to end an evening that had exceeded their expectations in every measurable way. The pendant, which Julia had finally placed around her neck during dinner, caught the light from the street lamp above them, creating a small point of brilliance against the dark fabric of her sweater. Julia told Andrew that wearing the pendant again felt like accepting something she had not realized she had been refusing for 10 years. A willingness to believe that some connections were strong enough to survive time and distance and all the ways people change as they grow older. Andrew replied that finding her again felt like fulfilling not just a promise to her, but a promise to himself. A commitment to believing that the most important things in life were worth pursuing even when the pursuit seemed impossible. They kissed then, standing in the snow beside Julia's car in the early minutes of Christmas Day, and Andrew understood that some promises create the future they seem merely to predict. The pendant between them caught the light like a small star, reflecting back 10 years of faith that had finally found its justification.